Hey there, and welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. I am so glad you're here. As we are heading into July, I thought it'd be perfect to talk to you about my personal favorite food. Not just my favorite thing to grow, not just my favorite fruit or vegetable to eat, but my all-time favorite food, and that is watermelon. If strawberries are the fruit of the spring, then I think we all know that watermelons are the fruit of the summer. There's just nothing quite like a cold, fresh watermelon, especially homegrown in the heat of the summer. Side note, if you're a big baseball fan and you're watching them on TV, my team is the Atlanta Braves. That is one of my favorite pastimes growing up, is having a big hunk of slice of watermelon, salted of course, while I'm watching my favorite team. That is summer perfection for me, but I digress. Because watermelon is my favorite food and one of my favorite summer treats to eat, I for sure wanted to include that in my garden. In fact, watermelon was one that I planted the year before my first official garden because it was that important to me. And having grown watermelon for over 11 years, I can tell you that some years I get all the harvest that I want and then some. It's absolutely incredible. But some years, not so much. Like last year wasn't the greatest watermelon year. Today on the podcast, I'm bringing back a subject that we've actually done in past years on the podcast, called What Can Go Wrong. Now, if you're interested in any past episodes, we'll put links in the show notes to some of those. But what I'm going to go through with you today is what can go wrong when you're growing watermelon, what you can do to prevent some of these things, and then what, if anything, you can do to remedy the problem if you see them. We're going to talk all the way from planting to care to harvest and talk about some things that can go wrong. So hopefully we can prevent them, especially with the watermelon harvest. Before we get into talking about one of the crops in our garden that most likely we're going to eat fresh, I want to make sure that you know about our next upcoming workshop, and this is going to be for the crops in your garden that you might want to preserve. It's called the Simplest Path to Preserving Your Harvest Workshop, and this is perfect for you if you are new to preserving or are wanting to dive a little bit deeper into understanding the basics of canning, freezing, and dehydrating, which is where most people start. I'm going to be talking to you about the difference between water bath canning and pressure canning, also freezing, what is blanching, do you need to blanch, what crops do you need to blanch, what do you not need to blanch, how do you get started with dehydrating, and maybe the most significant question I know I had as a beginner is which one do I choose based on which crop? Which method do I want to use? Or are there certain methods that are better for certain harvest or certain uses? We're going to dive into all of that in the Simplest Path to Preserving Your Harvest workshop. This is going to be held live on Tuesday, July 9th at 7 p.m. Central. And if you are listening to this before that workshop goes live, you can grab your ticket at the link in the show notes or go to journeywithjill.net/preserving workshop. And you can get a $10 off coupon code for a limited time at that link as well. And if you are listening to this podcast after we've already done the workshop, you can still get a ticket to the replay that you can access throughout 2024. So if you're interested in not only fresh eating, like we're going to be talking about with watermelon today, but you're also looking to preserve some of your harvest as well, then I hope to see you there at the Simplest Path for Preserving Your Harvest workshop at journeywithjill.net/preserving workshop. The first thing that can go wrong when we're planting and growing watermelon has to do with the planting itself. Now we're in mid-July, so most likely you're already past this point, but if you had issues here, then keep this in mind for next year. But one of the most common problems with watermelon, which I wouldn't say this is super common, so most likely you're not going to have issues with this, but if you did, then here's what you can do to remedy that in the future. And that is lack of germination. The most common problem with lack of germination when you're sowing your seeds, whether you're starting them indoors or you're directly sowing them into the garden, is that the soil is not warm enough. Think about it. When you are growing a crop like watermelon that loves the summer heat, the seed is also going to love warm soil. It's the way that the seed protects itself from germinating before its time or germinating in the middle of the winter when it's just going to die back with the freeze. So the soil temperature is really important. If your soil temperature is less than 70 degrees, you can probably bet that most of those seeds are not going to germinate, and they may germinate later when the soil warms up. But if you have a really wet spring, or if that soil is just too cold, often those seeds will rot in the ground and you won't get germination at all. So make sure to plant your seeds when the soil temperature is at least 70 degrees, but you'll get the best germination and the quickest germination if the soil is 85 degrees. Side note, I planted a succession planting of watermelon this year, and these are smaller watermelons that don't have as long of days to maturity, and I planted them in late May, I think. It might have been early June. They germinated in like 2 days. That's because the soil temperature is already very, very warm. They're going to germinate faster. If your soil temperature is closer to 70, then you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. But soil temperature is definitely a major thing. So how do you do this? For southern growers, if you have a long growing season like I do, just be patient. Wait and directly sow those seeds in the garden when the soil warms up. You have plenty of time to be able to get these watermelons to a harvest. Another thing that you can do, and this has been something that I have been doing for several years, is start your seeds indoors. You do have to be careful with these because you don't want to get them too large before you plant them in the garden. They're not going to grow at a snail's pace like peppers do. They are actually going to grow even faster than tomatoes do. So what I like to do is I like to sow my seeds indoors 3 to 4 weeks before my average last frost date so that I can get them out into the garden just a week or two after that, potentially, depending on the weather and the soil temperature. But you do not want to be starting them 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time. They're just going to outgrow their container and it's going to stress the plant altogether. So southern growers either wait or start seeds indoors. Now you may be wondering, why start seeds indoors if I already have a long season? Well, the reason why I do that is because I talked about wanting watermelon in July or even August. That's when I want to harvest them. But many times when I waited too long, and I wouldn't say too long, but when I waited to sow my seeds in the garden when the soil temperature had warmed up, and especially if I was growing a large watermelon like a Charleston Gray, which was one of my favorite, but they get huge, like 30 pounds, I was harvesting them in late September. And as much as I love watermelon and as much as it's my favorite food, I'm just not craving it in late September. Okay. So I kind of learned that my body likes to seasonally eat, and I'm just not craving even my favorite food in the fall. So that's one reason why I start seeds indoors now, is so that I can get that harvest a little bit earlier. If you are a northern gardener and you have a shorter growing season, it's probably pretty important for you to start these seeds indoors so that you can get a jump start on your season, so you can make sure and get that harvest before you lose that harvest window with cooler weather coming in. Another trick that you can use is that you can moisten the soil at the place that you're going to plant your watermelons, and then you can cover that area with black plastic to try to warm up that soil to get that soil ready for the watermelons. You can do this with watermelons. You can do this with sweet potatoes. Any soil that really needs a jump start in warming up, this is a good method. You can also sow those early sowings in grow bags, especially black grow bags, because they are going to heat up quicker. The soil's going to heat up quicker, so you might have better results doing that. Now, I wouldn't grow those huge watermelons in grow bags unless you have a solid plan for vertical gardening or something like that, or you plan on letting them sprawl everywhere. But for the smaller watermelons, this is actually a really good way to save some space and to be able to grow them in a container. Another reason that you may have issue with lack of germination, and this most likely is not going to apply to most of you, but I bring it up because it's happened to me, and that is you may be sowing old seed. I was saving watermelon seed. I've saved watermelon seed for many years, and I have a bag of seed that I saved from 2019, so 5 years ago. And I decided to plant them just to see if any would come up, and they didn't. And I figured the reason was because they were a little bit too old. So keep in mind, if you're saving seed, that could be an issue. But most of the time, lack of germination is going to be a direct result of the soil temperature. Next, let's move on to care. So this is what I'm talking about when your watermelon plant is growing. Either you've already planted it in the garden or it's already started to germinate. Here are some issues that you might run into as the plant itself is starting to grow and as the fruit is starting to grow. Number one is slow growth. The reason that this could be happening could be multifold, and it doesn't mean that these are the only reasons for it. But my first thought is it warm enough? Is the soil warm enough? Is the air warm enough? Basically, again, watermelon likes to grow in the warmth. So if you have a cold spring that's hanging on, you may notice that the growth is just not all that much, mainly because it hasn't warmed up enough. I've never had to do this because we warm up really fast, but if you live in an area where it's not super warm, you might consider a floating row cover just to be able to trap some of that heat. Make sure you get plenty of ventilation. Diseases can be a problem with watermelon. I personally have not really ever experienced it, but I know that they can happen. But putting a floating row cover can help trap some of that heat, especially early on in the season. Again, another thing is just to wait if you can. Wait to plant until the weather gets warm. Another reason for slow growth with watermelon could be that you didn't plant it in a sunny enough location. Watermelons love full sun. I didn't realize this until I planted 2 different crops of watermelon in 2 different areas of my garden. One got 100% full sun. I don't think it got shade the entirety of the day. And the other one got a decent amount of shade. I would say it was probably part shade, and I didn't realize it because it was at the back of my garden and I didn't really realize the trees and all of that. Now, I will say that particular garden area also didn't have as great of soil as the one that was in full sun. So I do believe the soil had something to do with it. But I think more than anything, when I have planted watermelons in full sun, they have done so much better as compared to part shade in any way. So evaluate how much sun your watermelon crop is actually getting. Related to slow growth, you may notice that your watermelon plant has a lack of vigor. This just means it's not growing at a really rapid pace. Maybe the leaves just aren't bright and they just don't look right to you. There could be a couple of reasons for that, such as not enough water. Watermelons, as you can hear from the name, they do require a little bit of extra water, especially as the plant is growing. Use drip irrigation if possible, just so that water can get directly to the root where it's needed and it's not getting all over the foliage of the plant. Another reason why you may notice a lack of vigor is that the fertility in the soil isn't high enough. As a member of the same family as squash and cucumbers, they love compost. My best watermelon harvests have been when they have been growing in more compost than anything else. They also like nitrogen, especially in the early part of the season where they are trying to produce a lot of leaves. If you've ever seen a watermelon plant, you know they sprawl everywhere. They're producing a lot of leaves. The reason they're producing a lot of leaves is because that leaf growth initiates photosynthesis, which brings sugars to the plant, eventually to the fruit. And it needs a lot of leaf growth to be able to grow one of these large melons. And in order to have this leaf growth, it needs abundant nitrogen. So if you notice that your watermelon plant doesn't have a huge amount of vigor, the leaves aren't growing, the vines aren't taking over, because a healthy watermelon plant, they're going to take over, then it could be a matter of fertility. Another problem you could notice in the growth of watermelon is poor fruit set. This means you might see a little fruit on the plant and it just doesn't grow. And this could be caused by poor pollination. What happens often is when that first watermelon starts to develop and the flower opens, it requires bee pollination. So number one, it could be too early in the season where the bees are off doing their own thing somewhere else with the wildflowers, or they haven't figured out where your garden is. So there may be a lack of bee activity anyway, or you could still be in the cooler, wetter part of your season if you live in a temperate climate. And that bee activity is going to be suppressed whenever you've got that cool, wet, like continuously rainy days. Let's say you've got several rainy days in a row and that watermelon blossom opens and those bees aren't going to be out pollinating. So it could be just a matter of poor pollination because of that. In that case, I wouldn't worry too much about it. The watermelon plant is going to produce fruit. It's going to produce another flower. I wouldn't stress out too much about it. But as the season progresses and you get these sunny days, if you're still not seeing bee activity and you're not seeing that these fruits are getting pollinated, you may want to have to step in and do some hand pollinating. I've talked about that in previous podcast episodes, but it's an easy Google search on how to hand pollinate. But that may be something that you might have to do at some point if you notice that the fruits are just not developing. Another problem with the fruit is watermelons can develop blossom end rot just like tomatoes do. And you'll notice that this is happening when the end of the watermelon fruit that's being produced starts to blacken. And just like with tomatoes, blossom end rot is caused by a lack of calcium getting to the plant. Most of the time though, and especially if you have amended your soil with compost, the calcium is not because it's not in the soil, but it's because it's not getting to the plant. And most of the time, that's because of inconsistent watering. This is the same if you're growing a tomato. Most of the time, the calcium is there. If you're growing in a raised bed or in the ground or in a container where you have plenty of compost, the problem is a lack of watering. So what do you do about this if you're starting to see this happening? Number one, keep the water consistent. If you're not getting consistent rains, make sure to have drip irrigation set on it and make sure that water is consistent. 1 to 2 inches a week is what I've heard is a good rule of thumb. But it's always good to check, do the finger test, especially during hot, dry periods, just to make sure that the soil is adequately moist, not waterlogged, but adequately moist. Another thing is mulch well. And I know this is difficult when you've got watermelon vines sprawled everywhere, but at the area where the plant is going into the ground, make sure that you have plenty of mulch. That's going to retain the moisture in the soil, which is going to make sure that the plant is not as drought stressed during times of dry periods. And finally, if you don't know the pH of your soil, it's possible that your soil could be a little bit too acidic. And if it's too acidic, that also can inhibit the uptake of calcium into the fruit. Ideally, watermelons grow best when the pH is between 6 and 6.5. So if you haven't done a soil test and you don't know the pH, you've done everything else you know to do, it could be a pH issue. And so a soil test would be my next suggestion. Another thing you might notice is what's called fruit bottlenecking. This is where the stem end of the watermelon is skinny and then the other end is thicker, kind of like a bottle. And most of the time, this is just caused by lack of pollination or incomplete pollination. So again, maybe the pollination happened on a limited basis, but it didn't get entirely pollinated. Another reason that this could happen is fluctuations in watering, especially when the plant is trying to mature. In this case, you could let it continue to grow and see if it ripens, or you could just go ahead and cut it off and let the plant focus on ripening the ones that are not bottlenecking. And it probably just depends on your decision on that. I don't know that I've ever really cut one off before, but I don't know that I ever actually got a good fruit out of that either. So it probably would have been a better decision just to cut it off so that the plant could focus on another fruit. Now we talked about vines. If you've never grown watermelon before, they vine everywhere. And so I put this in the what can go wrong category, not because anything is happening that's wrong, but more so because if you're a beginning gardener, it may seem like, oh my goodness, what happened? I planted this small little watermelon plant and now I've got a jungle. This happens to me a lot, but you can do a few things about it if you want to. Number one, if you're growing a smaller variety of a watermelon, you can grow it vertically. Now you're going to have to train it up the trellis somewhat. It does have little curly cues that'll hold on, but you do need to train it a little bit. And you need to be prepared to create some kind of hammock for the developing fruit. I say smaller varieties just because it's going to be easier to support that developing fruit if you only have to get some old pantyhose or those mesh bags that your onions come in at the grocery store. I've used those. It's a little bit easier to deal with a smaller fruit. But if you want to jerry rig something for a larger watermelon, just make sure that your trellis can support it and whatever you have holding it will support it. Because the heavier your watermelon gets, if it falls, the more likely you're going to have it completely bust. I've definitely been there myself. But that's one thing that you can do is to train these leaves to grow up, keeping in mind that you'll need to hammock those fruits. Another thing is to plan where you're planting your watermelon. I know this is probably too late this season, but in the future, plan on planting it where you're okay with the watermelon vines sprawling out in an area. This would be the same with sweet potatoes. Just make sure you're prepared for it. I think probably the most difficult thing with watermelons and sweet potatoes is if I'm planting it in a bed that's surrounded by grass and then I can't exactly mow the grass because I've got the watermelon vines on top, but then the grass will grow through it anyway. And then it becomes this messy, grassy, viney area. And then sometimes I'm afraid there's a snake lurking there. That can be an issue. So honestly, what I most of the time do is if I choose that area, I just go out there with boots just in case. But it can be a little bit frustrating. But keep in mind that your watermelons will produce vines, and honestly, the more the better, and it's going to hopefully produce a better fruit that way. All right, let's move on to what can go wrong at harvest, because if you've made it to the harvest, then this can be where some of the more challenging issues can arise, and potentially the most heartbreaking, because watermelons are not like other plants in that they're super easy to know when to harvest. It takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of luck in some cases to harvest watermelons at the perfect time. But before we get there, let's talk about the flavor here, because this can be a common concern. Let's say you harvest your watermelon at the perfect time and you open it and you start eating it, and it's just not as tasty as you expected, because you expect homegrown watermelon to be the best watermelon on the planet. So this may be a concern that you have because you eat it and it's not sweet. Keep in mind that watermelon has the best flavor when it's ripening in warm conditions. So for northern gardeners, you may want to choose a fast-growing variety or a smaller type of watermelon so that it can ripen quicker. And also start a little bit earlier. So that way, like start the seeds indoors so that they can start ripening when it's really warm. That's why your July and August watermelons are the most tasty. Generally, they're ripening in those warm conditions. Another thing that honestly you can't do a whole lot about that can affect how sweet the watermelon is what if you get too much rain really close to the harvest? And this is what happened to me last year. We ended up having quite a bit of rain in July, like more than usual, and we were having downpours. What this will do is it will end up diluting the sugars in the fruit altogether. Now, you can't control the rain, although I guess theoretically you could probably cover it. I don't know that I've ever gone to that effort, and I would imagine the rain would probably run down there anyway. But all that to say, you really can't do a whole lot to control the rain, but you can control how much you're irrigating. So hold off on watering the final week before you expect to harvest. And that's easy for me to say, and you're probably asking, okay, Jill, how do I know when the final week is before I expect to harvest? Personally, I would stop watering, turn that irrigation off. When you start seeing the tendril, we're going to talk about this in a minute, the tendril that's nearest to the watermelon, what you'll notice is that the watermelon has a stem that's connected to the main stem of the watermelon plant. And then right there at that juncture is going to be this little tendril, and it's going to be light green throughout the growth of the watermelon. I would recommend if you start seeing a watermelon fruit starting to develop, keep an eye on that tendril. Just keep watching it every time you go out there. But when that starts to dry up, then you know that the watermelon is signaling to starting to be ripe, and you can cut off watering at that point. Now, I know that's kind of hard. I know when I had drip lines over my whole garden, it wasn't really possible to cut off watering just to watermelons compared to the other garden. So I really wasn't able to do that. You can obviously control it. If you're hand watering, just stop hand watering. But I really enjoy now the Garden in Minutes garden grids, because when I'm growing them in raised beds, I can shut off that water to that particular bed while every other bed is getting watered. So if you have that ability, whether you're hand watering or some other way to cut off watering at that point, that's going to help the flavor. But then once you harvest that watermelon, you can resume watering, because each watermelon vine gets an average of 3 to 5 fruits per vine. And so once you harvest that first one, resume watering so the other ones can continue to develop. Now, one question that people have, especially if their watermelons are not sweet or they're not as tasty as they expect, is they ask, well, could they have crossed with other members of the cucurbic family, like other melons or squash? And they will not cross that way so that it affects their flavor. So don't worry about that. More commonly, you might be growing a variety that just isn't as sweet. And you'll notice that in the seed catalogs, they'll talk about how sweet a watermelon is, or maybe it has an old-fashioned flavor. When I see old-fashioned flavor, it's kind of, in my opinion, it's more of a watermelon-y flavor and less of a sweet. But if you see a variety with sweet in the name, like I love to grow Crimson Sweet, that's a huge cue that that's a more sweet variety. So consider the variety that you're growing. Ask people what's a flavorful variety, and also know that different watermelons have different nuances in their variety. I grow a specific orange watermelon called Orange Glow, and it doesn't taste like a red watermelon exactly. It has a less sweet flavor, and it has a texture that's a little bit different. And I actually really like it, but they are a little bit different. So keep in mind that certain varieties will have little differences in flavor profiles. The next thing that could go wrong when harvesting watermelon is you get your watermelon. The next thing that can go wrong with harvesting watermelons is watermelon split. This happened to me several times last year, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, you didn't harvest soon enough. I know it's going to be hard to know when to harvest, but perhaps it was overripe. And when it gets overripe, every little thing could cause it to split. But more commonly, most likely what you had is some kind of heavy rain right as it became ripe, right as it was nearing harvest. And that heavy rain is going to, the plant is going to push all that water into that melon. If there's no other place for it to go because the watermelon's already ripe, it's going to split. So what do you do if the watermelon splits? Well, if you're walking your garden every day and you catch it soon enough, just take it into your kitchen and start slicing it up. You're going to have to wash it because most likely it did get some dirt on it, or there might be some small insects that have made their way. If you let it go more than a day or so, it's going to start to rot, and you're going to be able to smell that. It's going to be pretty clear. But if you can catch it quick enough, you can salvage the melon. I did that quite often last year, actually, because it was that common. But if watermelon split, that's mainly the reason. Maybe you didn't harvest it soon enough, or you got a heavy rain, or a combination of both. It happens to all of us. But the main problem I think that people have when they're harvesting watermelons is harvesting too early. And that is so frustrating because you waited and you waited and you waited and you feel like it's the right time to harvest. And you take the knife to the watermelon, you're so excited, and you open it up and you get this very light pink. You can barely put your knife or your spoon into it. And then you try to taste it and it's not what you expected. And I think all of us who have grown watermelon have had that happen. I still have that happen because, like I said, there is a science to it to some degree, but some of it's a little bit luck. And some of it does depend on different climate conditions. And honestly, I would love to hear from a watermelon grower, like, how do you know for sure? How do you know for sure? But honestly, I'm growing so many different varieties. Sometimes the varieties even themselves have a little bit of a nuance, and it also depends on how you're growing them, how you can tell with these different signs. But let me give you the signs that I go by to try to make sure that I get my watermelon harvested at the perfect time. I mentioned earlier the tendril. This is the first indicator that my watermelon could possibly be ripe, and that is that the tendril nearest that vine, or nearest the stem that's nearest the watermelon, that will dry up to a complete brown. Now, if you're walking your garden every day and you're keeping an eye on that tendril, you'll notice that the top of that little curlicue starts to brown, and then the brown starts coming down closer and closer and closer until it completely dries up and it's completely brown. Now, the mistake that I have made in the past is once that completed the browning process, I would cut it, and then sometimes it would be ripe and sometimes it would not be. And I've found personally that most of the time, if I can wait up to a week, then I can most of the time make sure that that watermelon is ripe. Now, has that worked 100% of the time? No. But most of the time it does. Most of the time, if I'm keeping an eye on it and I know how long it's been since that tendril completely turned, waiting a week usually is the right choice. But there are other signs that I'm looking at also. So I'm trying to make sure, yes, the tendril's brown. I would never want to cut a watermelon if the tendril wasn't brown. I don't know that I've ever harvested one ripe where the tendril wasn't brown. But besides that, then I'm checking the bottom of the watermelon. If you're growing your watermelon where it's resting on the ground, then you can turn that watermelon over at any point of the growing season. And what you're going to see is this field spot is what it's called. And it's going to be light green to white when it's still developing. But when it starts to ripen, it's going to turn to a creamy yellow. Now, the shade of this creamy yellow will depend on the variety. Some are definitely more of a cream. Some, like Sugar Baby, are more of a bright yellow, or a deep color yellow. But again, if you are checking this, and I would make sure to check it and then put it back where it belongs. Don't rotate your melon, because then the field spot's going to be a little bit more difficult to see. Now, if you're growing them up a trellis, this is not going to be, and you can't decide that based on that, because you're not going to have a field spot. But if you have your watermelon on the ground, you can definitely go by this field spot as one of your indicators. Another thing you can do is use the thump test. We've all gone to the grocery store and you see those big bins of watermelons and you knock on them. I don't know about you, but when I've done that at the store, they all sound the same. But if you're doing this in your garden, what I like to do is I'll knock on a melon that I know isn't ripe, one where that tendril is still green, and I'll compare that to the tone that I get when I'm knocking on one that I think might be ripe. And you can tell that the one that's ripe is a more hollow sound compared to the one that is not ripe is definitely more dull, like it doesn't have any kind of reverberation. I'm sure all you music people could probably articulate this better than me, but you can tell the difference between an unripe melon and a ripe melon. Is the thump test the primary way that I would find out if a melon was ripe? No, it's one of the signs, one of them. The next sign is if you're watching your melon throughout the course of its development, while it's still developing, it has this powdery almost sheen to it. And I say powdery very loosely. It's not like it's actual powder, but you can, in some varieties, especially Sugar Baby, I notice I can rub my finger on the skin of that watermelon and I can see a difference. I can see that I'm rubbing off something, but that starts to fade. Or if you have a variety of watermelon where you don't necessarily have that thick of that sheen, you can notice that the appearance goes from slick, almost a slick appearance, to dull. The color starts to go from slick to dull. Again, this is something you're going to have to be watching, trying to go out in your garden every day and be able to notice those changes, but you'll notice that the color starts to become more dull. Now, a question you may ask is, if you harvest your watermelon, do they ripen off the vine? And the answer is no. Watermelons are a non-climacteric fruit, which means they are not going to continue ripening off the vine like a tomato will. But once you harvest them, they will last for about a week at room temperature or 2 to 3 weeks refrigerated. So you don't have to eat them right away like a tomato. You have a little bit of extra time. And honestly, I've kept mine in the refrigerator longer than 2 to 3 weeks, but they have more staying power for sure. Let me say one more thing before I finish up this section on harvesting, on when to harvest, is try different varieties if you consistently have issues with harvesting at the right time, or if you consistently have issues with, I don't really like the flavor of this. I found that trying different varieties really in any vegetable or fruit that I'm growing in my garden is helpful if you're not completely satisfied, but also try different years. Like I said last year, I had this big plan for testing different watermelon varieties last year. I had huge disappointments with some that a lot of people said were amazing, but I'm trying it again because one bad season with one variety doesn't mean the variety is, that you need to just chunk it. It may have just been the season. So try different varieties, but try again because some seasons are different than others. Okay, so let me just skim over pest and disease issues. There are many here that I found that could be an issue. Most of the time, I do not have any issues with my watermelon plants, but they do exist. So I'm going to skim over these. And then we have a link. This is a really kind of a helpful little web page here from the Texas Plant Disease Handbook that lists all the things that can go wrong with watermelons and what disease it could be. We'll link that in the show notes if you're interested in that. But if you haven't ever had issues with watermelon, I wouldn't necessarily go look at that because it might scare you away. I looked at all of these and I'm like, I don't think I've seen a single one. But if you have had issues with watermelon, then this can kind of help you to narrow down what the problem is. Number one would be skeletonized leaves. This could be caused by the cucumber beetle. If you know you have issues with cucumber beetle, then you could cover them before flowering. They will need access to pollinators once they flower. So if you have had that issue in the past, it could be cucumber beetle. Watermelon can also get powdery mildew. So if you see a powdery coating on the leaves, then it could be powdery mildew. I do have a podcast episode and a blog post about that. If you're interested in that, if that's an issue. I've had issues with powdery mildew, but never on my watermelon. So that may or may not be an issue for you. If your watermelon plant suddenly wilts, it could be fusarium wilt, but this is a different strain than the fusarium wilt that attacks cucumbers and tomatoes. The best defense against this is to rotate your crops or plant a disease-tolerant variety like Charleston Gray or Jubilee. If you notice necrotic lesions around the crown of the plant and then the plant starts to die, this could be anthracnose, alternaria, or downy mildew can appear like this as well. If the stem near the crown of the plant cracks and oozes amber liquid, it could be gummy stem blight. If the leaves are distorted and twisting at the end with no fruit or distorted fruit, then this could be something called watermelon mosaic virus. And the reason I skimmed over all of that is mainly because not everybody's going to have these issues. But if you do notice any of this during the growing season, come back to the show notes and check out that webpage that might be helpful for you. But for the most part, I have found in my experience that most of the issues with watermelon have to do with planting care and harvest, which is why I spent more time on that today. My goal with this episode for you has been for you to enjoy harvesting homegrown watermelon. There is nothing like it. Even if watermelon isn't your favorite food like it is mine, there's just something that says summer when you're growing your own watermelon and harvesting it. It's one of the pleasures of a gardener if you enjoy watermelon. And if you've made it this far, you probably enjoy watermelon. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. And don't forget, we have other podcast episodes in the past in this series, What Can Go Wrong? So if you're interested in those, check out the links in the show notes. I'm not sure that we'll be able to include all of them because there are several, but we'll at least put the ones that we think you might be most interested in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Beginner's Garden Podcast. If you're so inclined, I would love for you to submit a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It helps other gardeners to be able to discover this podcast to help them in their own journey. And of course, it helps to support the show as well. That's it for this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcasting player. If you haven't yet, we'll drop another new episode on Tuesday, but we also have a bonus episode coming on Friday. This was where I was a guest on another podcast, and especially if you're a beginner, I think you may enjoy this conversation. So we're going to be publishing it on this feed on Friday, July 5th. If you're doing any kind of traveling, then it will give you something else to listen to in the car, or if you're catching up on garden work like I usually am this time of year, then you get another podcast, a bonus one in your player as well. And then we'll be back next Tuesday where I'll be talking some more about preserving. And don't forget to grab your ticket if you're wanting to do any kind of preserving this year to the Simplest Paths to Preserving Your Harvest workshop, journeywithjill.net/preserving workshop, or the link is in the show notes. I hope you have a great start to your July. We'll see you next time.